Okay, so let's get into our reading of chapter 4 for our story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So this chapter is called The Letter. So if we look at this image, it says Mr. Utterson's clerk, guest, compared the note from the killer to the note of the famous Dr. Jekyll. So if you remember in chapter 3, we had a killing of a respectable man, and the murder was pointed towards Hyde. So they thought that Hyde was the killer, but he had vanished without a trace. They couldn't find him. So let's see if they find him in this chapter. So it was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door. He was let in by Poole, the butler, and had led across the yard to the laboratory. It was the first time Mr. Utterson had been in that part of the doctor's house, so he looked at everything with great interest. The laboratory was a dark building with no windows. Glass jars sat on tables, and dozens of boxes and papers lay about the floor. Behind the tables, narrow stairs led to a room which Dr. Jekyll used as an office. It was to this room that Poole brought Utterson. A fire burned in the fireplace. Close to the warmth sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deathly sick. He did not rise to greet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and welcomed him in a changed voice. "Have you heard about the killing?" asked Mr. Utterson. The doctor shivered. "They were shouting the news in the street," he said. "One word," said the lawyer. "Carew was my friend, but so are you, and I want you to know what I am doing. Are you responsible for hiding this fellow?" The doctor raised his hands as if to cover his face. "Utterson, I promise you," cried Jekyll. "I give you my word that I am done with him in this world. He is safe, and will never more be heard of." The lawyer was not happy. He did not like his friend's nervous manner. "For your sake, I hope you are right," said Utterson. "If it came to trial, it might be necessary to bring up your name. I cannot tell you how I know this, but I am sure he will never return," said Jekyll. "There is one thing I would like to ask you, Utterson. I have received a letter from Hyde, and I don't know if I should show it to the police. I should like to leave it in your hands and have you decide." "Well, then," said Utterson, "let's have a look at it." The letter was signed by Edward Hyde. It said that he was grateful for all of Dr. Jekyll's help, but it would no longer be necessary for the doctor to worry about him. He had a way to escape and would bother no one again. Utterson sighed with relief. "Have you the envelope?" he asked. "No," answered Jekyll quickly. "I burned it. Anyway, it had no mark from the post office since it was brought by hand." "One thing more," said Utterson. "Hyde was responsible for making you write that will, wasn't he?" The doctor grew more pale and nervous. He covered his face with his hands and nodded. "Well, you have had a fine escape," continued Utterson. "I'm sure Hyde wanted to kill you and collect the money." "Oh, more than that," moaned Jekyll. "I have learned something which I shall never forget." On his way out, Utterson stopped to exchange a word with Poole. "By the way, Poole," he said, "a letter was delivered by hand today. Who brought it?" But Poole was sure that nothing had come except by mail, and only flyers by that, he said. This news raised Utterson's fears. The letter must have come by the laboratory door, or maybe it had been written in the house. The matter should now be looked upon and handled with great care. That night the fog rolled over the streets and wrapped the city in silence. Mr. Utterson and Mr. Guest sat in the lawyer's study enjoying some wine. Mr. Guest had worked for the lawyer for a great many years and was a great student of handwriting. Perhaps the lawyer would ask him to look at the letter. "It was too bad about Sir Danvers Carew," said Guest. "Yes," answered Utterson. "I should like your opinion on that. I have written a letter in the killer's handwriting. It is such a chore to be responsible for deciding what to do with it." Utterson handed Guest the letter. Guest's eyes grew bright as he studied it with great interest. "No, sir, he's not mad, but it is a strange hand." Just then a servant entered with a note from Dr. Jekyll. "Oh," said Utterson, "Jekyll is inviting me to dinner." Mr. Guest was familiar with Dr. Jekyll's handwriting, after his many years of service to Mr. Utterson. "Could I see the note?" asked Guest. He put the papers next to each other and looked at them closely. "The two hands are equal in many points, only differently sloped," he decided. Guest and Utterson exchanged silent glances. "I would not speak of this note, you know," said the master. "No, sir," said the clerk in an equally serious voice. That night Mr. Utterson locked the note in his safe. "What," he thought, "Henry Jekyll signed for a killer?" And his blood ran cold.